Hey everyone, let's jump right into this explainer. Today we're taking a deep dive into the incredibly complex 1,500-year relationship between Jews and Muslims. We'll be grounding this entire discussion in the sociological and historical analysis of scholar Aaron W. Hughes, specifically his work Muslim and Jew, Origins, Growth, Resentment. And honestly, this isn't just your standard recounting of historical dates and battles. It's actually a really profound look at how these two distinct groups have historically used each other just to figure out exactly who they are.
To kick things off, we really have to ask ourselves a pretty critical question. You know that constant, tragic conflict we see dominating the headlines today? Is that just an eternal state of affairs? Or is it possible that our understanding of history has been completely clouded by modern politics? We have this huge tendency to project today's borders and battles backward into time. But as we're going to see, the actual historical record paints a vastly different and honestly a much messier picture.
Okay, here's our roadmap for the explainer. 1. Two flawed modern myths. 2. The fluidity of origins. 3. Constructing the prophet. 4. The Golden Age complex. And finally, 5. Mirrors of identity. All right, moving into Section 1, Two Flawed Modern Myths. Let's talk about the two dominant, totally oversimplified stories we hear literally everywhere.
We so often fall into one of two flawed extremes, right? On one side, we've got the romantic myth. This is that wistful fantasy of a golden age where Jews and Muslims lived side by side in perfect, uninterrupted harmony. But then, on the exact opposite side, we have the Lachrymose Myth. This is a fear-mongering, tearful narrative that claims it's just been an unbroken history of eternal hatred and persecution.
But here's the kicker. Hughes absolutely warns us against both of these essentialist views. Why? Because historical groups almost never fit into such neat, monolithic boxes. Whether somebody is pushing the romantic myth to offer this utopian hope for today, or leaning on the Lachrymose myth to justify modern hostilities, they are both doing the exact same thing. They're taking the messy, vibrant, highly complex reality of the past and just flattening it out to serve a modern political agenda.
So that brings us to Section 2, the fluidity of origins. Let's travel back to late antique Arabia, where this story actually begins, because things were way less defined than we usually assume. Now, we often picture standard rabbinic Jews, the kind who read the Talmud, either welcoming or rejecting early Muslims. But when we actually look at the historical record, it forces us to ask a totally different question about who was really living there. We basically have to strip away all our modern definitions of Judaism and Islam if we want to grasp what was actually happening on the ground back in the 6th and 7th centuries. The historical boundaries were just incredibly messy. I mean, there's literally no mention of these Arabian Jews in the Talmud or the Mishnah. None. We found gravestones and inscriptions, sure, but they completely lack standard Jewish liturgical formulas. Take the South Arabian Himyarite kingdom as an example. They converted to a form of Judaism, but they worshipped a generic monotheistic deity that they called Rahmanan, which means the merciful one. And get this, they didn't even speak Hebrew. They used Arabic, Sabaic, and Nabatean. They were practicing a really fluid, localized monotheism. It was definitely not the highly organized rabbinic Judaism that we're familiar with today. And actually, this fluidity totally applied to the other side of the equation too. Instead of calling them Muslims, scholars note that the earliest groups surrounding Muhammad were actually called believers, or mu'minun. They shared these intense apocalyptic hopes and a very porous ecumenical monotheism with Jews and Christians alike. At this early stage of the game, it would have been nearly impossible to draw a hard line distinguishing a Jew from a Muslim out in those desert oases. All right, Section 3, Constructing the Prophet. Obviously, that early fluidity couldn't last forever, so let's look at how those strict boundaries were actually formed. Just think about this timeline for a second, because there is a massive gap between the actual life of the prophet and the texts that later defined his biography. Muhammad traditionally died in 632 CE, but the first major biography, the Sirah, by Ibn Ishaq, wasn't written until over a century later. And then, roughly 50 years after that, Ibn Hisham revised it specifically to strip out stories that seemed, well, too Jewish. It shows this very conscious effort to build a firm wall between the two emerging faiths. So the Sirah really isn't an eyewitness history. It's a hagiography, a sacred, stylized biography.
It was created in cosmopolitan centers like Baghdad generations after the fact. You see, the early Islamic community needed to legitimize its new movement in a highly competitive religious marketplace. They had to flesh out their prophet's life, provide some solid context for the Quran, and really solidify their own unique identity entirely apart from the older traditions.
What's truly fascinating is how this separation actually happened in the texts. Later authors retroactively used the idea of the Jew as a foil. In these writings, the Jew became a super convenient literary trope for stubbornness and resistance. By constructing these stories of Jewish resistance to Muhammad, early Muslims were able to define exactly what early Islam was, simply by deciding definitively what it was not.
Moving on to Section 4, the Golden Age Complex. This takes us right into the Middle Ages, an era that gets so often romantically labeled as this perfect golden age of pure coexistence in places like Muslim Spain, Baghdad, and Cairo. But rather than some utopia of interfaith dialogue where everyone was just holding hands, Hughes points out something way more intriguing. These medieval thinkers largely ignored the actual everyday individuals of the other faith. But they heavily, and I mean heavily, use the concept of the other group in their writings. They weren't engaging with real breathing people, they were engaging with theoretical stand-ins. And this dynamic created a really fascinating mirror effect. On one hand, Sunni Muslim theologians used the label of Jew as a straight-up insult to define Islamic unorthodoxy. They'd often laud the term at Shia Muslims just to discredit them. On the flip side, Jewish elites, who were living as a minority under Islamic rule, actively adopted Islamic formats and vocabulary to build out their own Jewish orthodoxy. A prime example of this is Kalam. Kalam is an Islamic theological framework that was built to reconcile rationalism with monotheism. Well, Jewish intellectuals, like the famous Saadia Gaon, eagerly absorbed this exact same Islamic methodology. They literally used it to organize and defend their own Jewish beliefs, essentially creating what Hughes brilliantly calls an Islamic Judaism. They were intensely thinking about themselves, but using the other group's language to do it. Which brings us to Section 5, Mirrors of Identity. Let's tie this entire 1,500-year history together into one cohesive concept. So the ultimate takeaway here is that Judaism and Islam didn't just passively bump into each other as history marched on. They actively built their own identities by observing, reflecting, and reacting to one another. Whether we're talking about the fluid deserts of ancient Arabia or the incredibly scholarly courts of medieval Baghdad, they used each other as a sounding board to carve out their own unique spaces in the world. There's this brilliant quote from religion scholar Jonathan Z. Smith that anchors Hughes's entire thesis perfectly. He says, "The problem is not alterity, but similarity." It's so true. Proximity breeds anxiety. When a neighboring group is just a little too much like you, when you share apocalyptic visions, dietary laws, and monotheistic roots, you desperately need to define the other, just so you can understand and secure your own self. When you really dig into Hughes's analysis, you see that the contemporary anxieties we have over physical borders and land in the Middle East are structurally identical to these ancient anxieties over social and religious boundaries. The medium has completely shifted from theology to geography, sure, but the underlying mechanism, that desperate, deeply human need to define us against them, remains exactly the same. Which leaves us with a pretty profound question to end on. If their entire history is just this complex dance of mutual self-definition, where neither group's identity fully makes sense without the other, how should that reshape our understanding of the headlines we read every single day? It's not just a clash of ancient enemies, it is a tragically intimate relationship where each side is still trying to figure out exactly who they are simply by looking at who is standing across from them. Think about that the next time you hear someone try to oversimplify this relationship. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the narrative.